In 1979, these images were broadcast all over the world. Soviet troops were invading their southern neighbour, Afghanistan. This event would bring about the end of the process known as détente. Détente had given us panda politics. It had also given us cooperation, the most famous example being the Apollo-Soyuz orbiting mission. The Soviet invasion in 1979 of Afghanistan ended both of these. The two sides that had been getting on better now became sworn enemies once again. The reason for this was the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan. As we go through this presentation, I strongly suggest that you make notes summarizing each slide. In 1978, the communists took over in Afghanistan. This new government in Afghanistan started to persecute and pick on the Muslims in that country. This made the country increasingly unstable. The Russians were keen that the communists stayed in charge in Afghanistan. They wanted a friendly nation on their southern border. But the hostility of the Muslims towards the communist government was worryingly starting to spread into the Soviet Union itself. Therefore, in order to keep a friendly government in power in Afghanistan, the Soviets invaded, knowing fully well the consequences it would have on their relations with the Americans. The reason the Russian leader Brezhnev gave was that his forces were invited in. He claims that this was the truth. They were invited in by the Afghan government to help protect the government. You need to make up your mind whether this was a convincing argument. Of course, he was questioned about this in the light of other events that had happened. So, for example, the Helsinki Agreement promised to respect borders. What would also happen to the ongoing negotiations regarding the SALT II treaty? Brezhnev had weighed up the pros and the cons of this and decided that securing Afghanistan was more important than his relationship with the Americans. Why was Afghanistan so important? Well, these are the following reasons. It was a neighbour to the Soviet Union and it was against Iran. Iran was a country hostile to everyone at this time, and the Russians needed Afghanistan between it and them. Iran was spreading Muslim fundamentalism, which the Soviets thought was very threatening to them. Brezhnev was determined that the risk of Muslim fundamentalism would not spread into the Soviet Union. The Americans decided that they would support the people in Afghanistan who were fighting back against the Russians. These were called the Mujahideen. Today you know them better as the Taliban. $8 billion of American and British and Western aid was given to these people to fight the Soviets. President Carter also regarded the Soviet invasion as the most dangerous threat to world peace since the end of World War II. These are strong words, bearing in mind the Cuban Missile Crisis of the 1960s. He regarded the Soviet actions as a way, an excuse of ending the SALT II negotiations. President Carter also announced the Carter Doctrine, his own policy to contain any further spread of the Soviet Union. So, the importance of the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan. The Soviets would fight the war in Afghanistan for 10 years. It's often referred to as their own Vietnam. The Americans, the British, supplied the rebels fighting back against the Russians with money and weapons. Over 1.5 million people will die in this war between the Mujahideen and the Russians in Afghanistan. This war cost the Soviet Union $8 billion a year, simply a sum that the Soviet Union could not afford to spend. The SALT II treaty was abandoned. The West put economic sanctions, economic punishments on the Soviet Union. President Carter announces his Truman Doctrine, his Carter Doctrine, I beg your pardon. For a man who is renowned as a president who believes in peace, the Carter Doctrine was very aggressive. He was determined that the Soviets would not make a move on the Persian Gulf, which is where most of the West's oil came from. He put soldiers on immediate war footing, deployed troops to the region, and effectively threatened war against the Soviet Union if they did anything else. Most famously, the Americans refused to attend the Moscow Olympics of 1980. In return, the Soviets wouldn't join the American Olympics in Los Angeles in 1984. Understandably, all of this marks the end of the period known as détente and will usher in, under the next American president that we will study next time, the Second Cold War. Your task will be to complete this newspaper article, summarizing your notes on one sheet. You can also do the consequence and significance activity here as a Diamond 9, though you'll have to draft this yourself. Place the statements from the most to the least important. As a minimum, I would need you to identify the top 3 most important and significant consequences of the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan. And then, on the PowerPoint attached, you have the consequence question that you can attempt.